life is not black and white. It's not just you're for us and against us. My wife Juliana is fond of saying that the secret to life is natural learning sequences. We learn to crawl, and we learn to walk, and we learn to run, and we may learn to jump. And these sensory motor skills develop, one comes before the other. We build on them in a natural way. And there's all sorts of feedback loops we go through to learn these things, to learn how to crawl and walk and all these things that an infant does so well. We also learn how to count. We learn how to do simple arithmetic. We add, we subtract. Then we multiply and divide. Eventually, we learn algebra. At some point, we may even learn calculus. Not all of us, but some of us. We also go through a sequence where at some point we experience these things, strange things that make us all excited or make us sad or make us whatever. And eventually we realize that we have feelings, we have emotions. And at some point we can actually name them. And then we can reflect on them with this naming. And as we reflect on them, we can start to understand them. We can start to even kind of regulate them. And as we learn to master them in various ways, we even see the transformative power of learning about ourselves and using the experiences that trigger us in life to help us grow. So the context that we find ourselves in, I think everybody's familiar with this notion of the Vuca world, where we experience this sense of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, but as Bob Keegan will say, relative to the way we make meaning of the word. So some people will find that things are very complex for them or create a lot of uncertainty, and other people say, well, that's old news. That's simple. And we all have somewhere we're at on this journey. Now, this notion of, right? How many recognize this situation, right? Yeah. How many have been in this boat? How many of you have had bosses sitting up at the top end of the boat? This notion that these learning sequences are so important, part of what we're trying to do in terms of applying these notions of adult development to leadership is, as Christian was pointing out, become able to find out how are we part of the systems, how are we co-creating the consequences that we're fussing about or observing at a distance and wondering why there's a problem for somebody else. So producing the results that we really requires constant feedback, constant learning. And we want to talk about this as Christian kind of laid out 6 stages for us. I'm going to break this in terms of how we look at the underlying structure of our thinking and talk about 4 different phases. The first phase here, we could say that there's a place we get to where the structure of our thinking is if-then. We recognize that one thing comes before another, that something causes something, and the focus of our attention at this point is looking at who's to blame. If there's a problem, something went wrong, who do we blame? What kind of skills do we need to develop? What kind of attitudes and habits and points of view? And we have this as our frame of reference. But at a certain point, we recognize that life is not black and white. It's not just you're for us and against us. It's that you start to see that there are systems. You might understand your family as a system. You might understand your team at work has team dynamics, and there's small system dynamics. So you have interrelated groups with different roles. You also start to see that there's multiple causality. There's multiple considerations or factors that are playing into what the situation is, what's happening on. Now, you do this for a while, and you come to see that there are even more advanced systems, that there are cultural contexts, as Thomas was talking about this morning, that the ways in which society helps shape us and help us normatively come into how to fit in and so on, that we can start to consciously work with these systems and see that they're integrated multiple groups. So for instance, this might be something like United Nations, where there's many different complex sets of relationships. At some point, though, we get overwhelmed by this sense of complexity. And what we're really searching for is the elegant simplicity on the other side of complexity. Finding a sense of how you abstract the essence, the strange attractor that is creating the complex systems, and you can work with these as leverage points in very complex ways. Now, for leaders in organizations, this has a big impact. What you can operationally work with. You can use all the words you want. So I did a presentation like this just after Peter Senge once, and we talked about how he's doing this kind of thing, working with large markets and dynamics and institutions and so on. But people take systems thinking and they take the language of it and they operationalize it often either here or here, and somehow don't quite get the fullness of what is offered or the opportunity that is presented. And so people then say, oh, it's just a fad, or it didn't work the way we thought, so there's something wrong with it, rather than there's something not yet matured in our own way of relating to it. Now, one of the things that we introduce here is saying we have measured these kinds of things for many years now, decades, and we know that there is a kind of distribution curve of these different structures of thinking. So you could look at these as underlying patterns of structure, not so much about the content of what we think about, but about how we think about it. So what we see is that about 60% of the adult population is using this if-then thinking. You can think, I remember when George Bush was president, it was like, you're either for us or against us, right? We can think of more modern examples of this kind of thinking in the White House. At the same time, and I had a student going through this transition, she said, you know, I feel really frustrated with myself. I used to be able to kind of know the right answer. And now there seems to be a lot of different answers. And I said, well, now you're moving into the 30% who are starting to actually see that there are multiple sources of experience, multiple frames of reference, multiple perspectives on things. And that this is her sense of a deconstruction of herself and a feeling of frustration and self-guilt. Well, I said, no, this is just part of the natural learning sequence. And it's a positive step. It may feel disorienting at the moment, but it's actually a very positive step. Now, you notice there's not so much left here. And this is where we see the dearth of leadership. We feel this cry for the leadership to deal with the complex problems we have, and we find that there's maybe 9% of the population that can actually think at this level of highly complex systems, and maybe less than 1% thinking in this early principled thinking where you really understand what the nub of the issue is and can elegantly, in a way that anybody can understand, communicate something that can have an impact. So why does this matter? You know, what does it do for leaders especially? And I'll tell a short story, a woman named Heidi for sake of convenience. And Heidi was a leader of a fairly large governmental organization, dealing with a lot of complex dynamics in relation to environmental, transportation, political regulation, a lot of things she had to deal with. And she came and she said, I've got this frustration because I go in with my team and I try to lay out the agenda, get the points across, and I want them to get motivated and engaged, and they don't seem to. I don't get the results I'm looking for. And so she was working in this, and she was getting some feedback in these ways, and she came one time and she said, I've got the solution. I just told them to create the agenda. And then she said, but that didn't work either. Then they didn't. And what she'd simply done is exchange one kind of polarity for the other, but she hadn't actually evolved the structure of her thinking. It was an either or kind of proposition. Either I tell everybody what to do, or I let them tell us what to do. Through this natural learning cycle, she suddenly realized that what was actually possible was to have a little bit of both. That she could set some high-level frames and then invite some participation where they had enough structure where they could orient and contribute where they were able to contribute. And this insight for her that she could actually not just be at either pole, but actually integrate those, allowed her to lead in a way that her team was much happier with, as you can imagine. So the next question is, why is this difficult, right? We all see that it's aspirational. We feel the call. We want to step out of where we're at to grow into something more. The challenge is, and this is very common in society, we identify with our competence, our knowledge, our skills, whatever it is. And so as soon as we take up this kind of learning cycle, the first thing you do is you get worse because you're practicing something new and unfamiliar. So your performance drops. I don't want to look like a fool, right? This is what Suzanne is good at. We talked about the wise fool. People don't want to go there. That's really scary. The other thing is we often find ourselves, as Bob Keegan coined so well, in over our heads. We find that the demands of our job, of our family, of our relationship, of our community group, of whatever, are somehow more than we feel capable of. We can't seem to get our heads and hands and hearts around it, and so we experience a certain kind of inner tension. And now, we can respond to that tension with a sense of increased embeddedness, right? We can withdraw and just try and push harder, do more of what we already know better. Or we can have a curiosity about other perspectives. As Christian said in his talk, an openness. So the next question would be, what helps? Edgar Schein has this wonderful phrase, humble inquiry. He says, access your ignorance. To find this place of genuine unknowing and genuine curiosity where we're not trying to hold on to everything so that we can be safe and secure or we can validate or justify our view, but actually find comfort in ignorance. Perspective seeking. I think, Thomas, you mentioned this earlier. This is, there was a PhD done recently that looked at a large-scale set of data and program doing leadership development in these kind of ways, and found that the thing that drove this kind of development the most was seeking out, actively looking for clarification or new knowledge from others, seeking their perspectives and being open to it. Having compassion for ourselves and others. we add layers of unnecessarily complicated messes to ourselves when we feel self-judgment, guilt, doubt. Now, being critically reflective is one thing, but just beating ourselves and flogging ourselves isn't helpful. Appreciation. So the Institute of Heart Math, some of you may be familiar with their work. They've done a lot of work in the field of neurocardiology. And what they see is there is a very powerful, I think if I say it right, biophysical, social impact from the way the brain in our heart coordinates multiple activities in us. And having an attitude of appreciation actually allows for a coherence of this that has immense benefits for us. Now, in terms of leadership, the development work we do in the university classroom for managers in different levels of civic society, corporate organizations, governmental ones, we talk about this model of cleaning up and growing up. And one of my favorite phrases that many of you, I think, are familiar with and have heard comes from the former CEO of Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien. The success of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. Now, that sounds nice, right? Well, what the hell does it mean? Well, how do we do something about it? So we want to look a little bit at a number of components in this inner condition and see what is the relationship between this and these notions of maturity and building skills and complexity of thinking. Because for me, there is something very important that how we use our growth and maturity, what we grow for, is very important. So, some of you may be familiar with the Arbinger Institute work, Leadership and Self-Deception, the Anatomy of Peace, the Outward Mindset. One of their key starting places is your heart at peace or your heart at war. The same thing with coherence in heart math or many other things. Martin Buber's notion of an I-thou relationship or an I-it relationship. This is the starting position. This is a component of our inner condition. Now, if our heart is at war, what tends to happen is we have self-doubt, self-deception, and justifications. We cannot help but try to make ourselves right, to try and validate our perspective. And there's all sorts of things we could go into around this. The challenge then is we add complexity of mind to self-deception. And what we get is more complex obfuscations of reality, more messes. Now, Christian was a co-author on a paper that we published in the journal that I edited a number of years ago. So how many of you remember Anders Breivik? Right? Here is someone who actually had a reasonable complexity of mind. But what was it in service of? Right? Was his heart at war or heart at peace? And so we see that this complexity of mind, the complexity of thinking in and itself is not everything. If we then have a heart at peace, we can look at this road and say, okay, this will allow us to gain self-awareness, clarity, purity. And when the inner condition of the heart has this state, and then you add complexity of mind, what you can get is robustness, resilience, and coherence. Why this matters for leadership? For self-leadership? You bet, right? One of the talks that I use a lot in my courses, this person says, you know, how we think about others, whether our heart is at war or at peace, matters a lot to them. But actually it matters even more to us. And so in terms of the kind of leadership that matters in the world, we need leaders who can get their head around the complexities of the things we're dealing with. We need them to be able to operationalize it and take action and actually get their hands around it. And we also need them to have their hearts in the right place, to get their hearts around the world. Now, I'm supposed to remember this. So I got to put something in the box, right? And so I was saying, I'm not usually good at these symbolic things and that, but when Beta said this, I got this thing. So the Institute of Heart Math gave me this little, I like to think of it as a golden heart. And for me, it represents this heart at peace. And the prismatic, kind of, it's got many facets to it here, represents all these different perspectives that we can align and make coherent and coordinate and integrate this heart and head and hands so that we can lead in the way the world is calling us.